Lord our God, for all that this day has been and all that it represents, we give you thanks. We lament that we can't be together tonight, sharing a picnic and conversations, but are grateful for this time and space that we do have. Thank you for each person, each one of those faces and names that we see here tonight, for the places where they live and the ways our lives intersect. Help us to be church together and help us to be your ministers in the world. Lord, we pray your mercy upon us tonight. Lead us by your Holy Spirit. Be with us and fill our hearts and our minds, our words and our ears with your voice and your word. Lift up Elise as she leads us, and Tiffany. Thank you for them. And lift up our hearts to you in all these prayers in Jesus' holy name. Amen.
All right, everyone, welcome again. If you just joined us, there is a placemat, what we call, in the chat that you can link to. It was sent out earlier as well. We do ask that if it's possible for you to print that out and have that in front of you. Now the print may be too small for some of you to read once it's printed out, or you may not have a printer handy. So in that case, you can have it accessible to pull up when we get to our discussion a little later on. But I wanted to point that out to give you a chance to do that while we're opening up here. Today, we're going to participate in a public deliberation forum, which is a structured dialogue about a particular issue. As you know, the issue we're exploring today is the church's role in a divided society. Before we dive into that though, I do want to discuss our purposes for gathering. Deliberation isn't designed to significantly change people's minds, nor is it designed to guide us as participants to consensus around a particular issue. Forums like this aren't intended to produce outcomes in the form of action plans. But we do have other outcomes in mind. And I'd like to describe for you why we've chosen this format. The first outcome and our hope for having this public deliberation today is that we think it can inform our way of thinking. So we understand that there's more than one legitimate stance or course of action that a church might take in a divided society. By our forum today, we will share a vocabulary and a sense of the advantages and drawbacks to each stance that the church may have. And we'll present that here as three options: the church as refuge, the church as mediator, and the church as prophetic voice. Again, we acknowledge those aren't the only positions churches can take, but so often we get locked into a kind of binary way of thinking. And we'd like to open that up at least a little bit today so that we have different ways of understanding what it is the church can be. Our other desired outcome, as Tiffany mentioned, is that we hope to model some spiritual practices today, specifically compassionate communication. And we want to affirm a sense of, we want to affirm a congregation-based model of church. Which is particularly appropriate on Covenant Day, particularly relevant for a Baptist church. Today, we're going to practice learning from each other and giving everyone an opportunity to be heard. People of all backgrounds can certainly weigh in on the divisiveness that we're currently experiencing in American society. But we also know that there are folks at Dayspring who have jobs and experiences caring for people and institutions who are affected by this divisiveness. So we have therapists and educators, law enforcement, members and leaders of civic organizations and associations. Obviously, we have clergy, medical professionals, and many others. So let's learn from our collective experience and together share our concerns in a spiritual way. Third, we want to share some hope and encouragement so that each of us as individuals or households, and that all of us as the church can understand that we can have a redemptive role in society. So having an understanding of the three options, church as refuge, church as mediator, church as prophetic voice, and then having time to reflect on which of those options suit our individual temperament and circumstances can equip us to have a sense of what we can do in this divisive moment. So even though we're framing this as the role of the church in a divisive society, we have to remember that the church is not just Dayspring as an institution, but each of us are church. And so we can ask this question in two ways. What is my role as church as part of the body in a divisive society? And then what is the role for Dayspring? So we want to present that there is a redemptive role that we can participate in and invite us into that. And then finally, we hope that today we'll begin to get a sense of where our church stands. So we'll hear everybody's perspectives, and then we hope that will inform other discussions in the future. We're planning to do an Advent study on the church's response to racism. And so a forum like this serves an information gathering purpose. And at the end, we'll have a poll, and that's really important for everyone to fill out. If you know you're going to have to jump off this meeting early, please email Tiffany. We'll put a questionnaire in the chat at the end as well. So if you can't participate in that poll, or you just like a little more time to reflect, you will have an opportunity to give feedback. And that's going to be really important for understanding, again, where everybody stands on this. So that's our purpose. So those are our purposes, our intended outcomes, what we're hoping for today. We're going to do this by engaging in deliberative dialogue. So in our breakout groups and in final reflection, we are going to prayerfully understand the pros and cons of these three options that we describe as the church, these three stances that we might take. And with each option, we're going to understand, or we're going to talk about the benefits, the drawbacks, and the trade-offs. So no single option is the right option. There are legitimate reasons why churches take up these different stances and legitimate things that hold them back from adopting these positions. So we want to give time to explore the benefits and the drawbacks. In deliberative dialogue, we move beyond the initial positions that people hold to get to some of the deeper motivations. So the things that we consider to be most valuable in everyday life. Part of what we're doing here is is getting to the values level of discussion. So what is it that we hold to be most important? What is it that we see our church as really being about? Instead of throwing out statistics and sound bites, we're not trying to win a debate here, right? We're trying to really get to the deeper motivations and to understand each other. So deliberative dialogue really invites us to weigh carefully the views of others and to appreciate the impact that various options would have on what others consider to be valuable. So part of what we're doing today, as I mentioned, is sharing values, but we're not doing that just so that we can speak into a void. We're doing that so that we can be heard and so that we can listen to each other. And so once we begin to listen to each other, we begin to think about the drawbacks to each of these options in their eyes, not just our own. So we hope to be practicing some empathy as well today. We hope to work through the conflicting emotions that arise when various options pull and tug on what people consider valuable. So part of spiritual maturity, I believe, is learning to hold paradox. And we're going to, this format of deliberative dialogue allows us to do that. And then finally, deliberative dialogue in a faith setting invites us to rely on our faith and to rely on the Holy Spirit to guide our time together. So are there any questions that you might want to drop into the chat about the way we're doing this, what we're beginning to explore today? Okay, so let's talk about some ground rules. So I've talked in theory a little bit about what it is we're doing today. Baylor has a Public Deliberation Initiative, what we call PDI, that has helped us format our program for today. And they've put together these ground rules that we will put up on the screen. Thank you, Tiffany. And we'll begin to, these will structure the ways that we talk to each other. So the first ground rule I want to cover here is the idea that deliberation is not a debate. So we're not debating each other. We're not trying to win points. We're not trying to convert other people to our way of thinking. Rather, we're trying to really tap into what is tugging at our hearts, and to use that to use our hearts to listen to others. So we're wrestling with these tough questions together, and that requires that we consider various perspectives and look for common ground. In a debate, we're typically not trying to look for the common ground. We're trying to score points over the person we consider to be wrong. So today we're having a bit more openness. Everyone in this deliberation is expected to be fully present and to engage in the deliberation. So I want you to know that your voice matters. It doesn't matter if you're an official member of the church, if you've been around for a long time, if you're fairly new, if you know a lot about politics, if you've just checked out of politics because it's too difficult over these past couple months. It doesn't matter what situation has brought you to this forum today. The fact that you're here shows that you are willing to be open to the discussion. And we ask everyone to be willing to contribute, and to contribute in a way that is respectful of time. So you'll see on there, on the ground rules, it says no one or two individuals should dominate. Be intentional about both listening and speaking. We'll have breakout groups, and in our groups, we'll have about 15 minutes to discuss each option. So we'll have our facilitators keeping time, but that said, you know, you should be mindful not to take up 5 minutes with just your point of view when you're in a group of people of more than 3, and you only have 15 minutes to discuss the options. So be intentional about listening as well as speaking. In each breakout group, we'll give all of the major choices, the 3 options we talked about, equal consideration. We're going to give them equal time and an equal framework for discussing those. And that just makes it fair, right? One other thing I want to mention here is that deliberation, as I said before, is about values. It's about identifying what's important to us. It's not about debating facts or statistics. So this is the kind of language we're used to going back to in debate, right? And in a kind of disputational form of discussion. Today, we're going to ask you to really speak from the heart. At the beginning, we'll have you talk about your stake in this issue. And we really want you to use I language, right? What does this mean to you? What is of concern to you, right? And to not bring in all sorts of facts and statistics, which studies show don't really actually help us get to the heart of an issue, right? And so we're going to maintain an open and respectful atmosphere. And final point here on the ground rules, the discussion should focus on the approaches using the discussion guide provided as a common starting point. So I've mentioned it before, you might have just joined us. We have this in the chat. This is the what we call the placemat. If you can print this out and have it in front of you, this will help us to use this guide as a common starting point. You can pull it up on your screen, but having it in front of you, a hard copy of it, will allow you to actually look at people on the screen and to talk to them. So having eye contact, even in the strange forms that Zoom sets up, is better than everyone just looking at a document, right? So if you can have that in front of you, that would be great. Okay, any questions at this point? I think my cat's about to join us, so I'm just warning you of that. I'll do my best to keep him out the way. Forgot to close the door. Okay, so let me give you an overview of the 3 options that we'll be discussing in the groups. So we're talking about this question of the church's role in a divided society. Churches are wrestling with how to live out their faith in an increasingly divided American culture. So research indicates that partisan politics affects congregations and how we interact, how we worship, and how we fellowship with each other. It affects how clergy preach their sermons and how or if we engage in the public square. Even if we want to abstain from the political commotion, the fact is that politics often finds us in our churches, whether we desire it or not. And sometimes this happens in devastating ways. So we know that houses of worship have been vandalized. We know that arsonists have burned down churches. We're even very sadly aware that gunmen have murdered worshipers in their very sanctuaries. The attacks on people of faith everywhere have ramifications for worshipers everywhere. Now, these are extreme examples, but they point to how dangerous divisiveness is to our community, the larger society, and within churches themselves. The state of divisiveness that we're in didn't happen overnight. It's the result of long-standing cracks in the foundation of our democracy and communities that have been worsened by increasingly reactive and inflammatory rhetoric. Accordingly, the process for bridging these gaps will not magically appear, but it will be the result of an intentional and deliberate effort on the part of people of goodwill to find common ground and rebuild our foundations. So that's what we're doing today. What is the church's role in this process? We'll discuss 3 options, but it's important to remember that they are not the only 3 options churches can take, nor are they mutually exclusive. So today we're going to try to stay away from binary thinking, meaning thinking that we have to choose one way to respond and then stick with it. Churches can respond in multiple ways about the same issue or even about different issues, and we can individually respond in multiple ways as well. What we do by separating them out as options helps us to clarify the strengths and drawbacks of each, as well as the theology behind it. The theology around what we assume church is for, and the theology about how God uses us in the world. So the first option is the church as refuge. This approach asserts that the primary focus of the church should be on our religion and not on political tensions or the bitter partisanship that can divide us. This point of view argues that the church should work to avoid the culture wars and create a sanctuary where people come together to worship Christ, regardless of political lines and across race, gender, and socioeconomic statuses. This position holds that the fundamental ministries of the church primarily include worship, faith formation, congregational care, and being Christ's presence in the world through service. As such, the church should refrain from taking political stances on issues that may cause division among the congregation and distract from these core missions. to the greatest extent possible, the church should leave room for diverse perspectives. So that's option one, and you'll have 15 minutes to discuss that option in more detail. That's the church as refuge. The second option is the church as mediator. This approach asserts that the primary focus of the church should be on helping people of faith navigate the political fray we're in, navigate the tensions and the bitter partisanship that divides us. The church should build bridges of cooperation. The church should actively promote healing and understanding and transformation across the divisions. People who hold this position, the second option, believe that the fundamental ministries of the church should primarily include pastoring, teaching, faith formation, and congregational care. As such, the church should actively teach congregants how to engage with different perspectives, how to listen to marginalized or unheard voices, and how to be agents of reconciliation for individuals, communities, and society. And then finally, we have the third option, the church as prophetic voice. This approach asserts that a primary focus of the church should be to engage in the public square in order to live fully into its mission. The church should be a prophetic voice in the midst of the political fray, the tensions, and the bitter partisanship that divides us. People who hold this position believe that the fundamental responsibilities of the church should include speaking to the cultural and political issues of the day, pursuing justice, and advocating for righteousness. As such, the church should actively speak, engage, and lead in addressing issues of the day. The church should consider how it can wield its power and influence for good, and should actively work to be Christ's presence in the world. This prophetic voice will manifest in different ways depending on a church's denomination, its leadership, and the moral and ethical commitments of its members. So those are our three options. We're going to dive into breakout groups where we'll explore these options in a conversational, dialogical way. And again, we'll have 15 minutes for each option. We'll have the facilitators who will be paying attention to the time, but again, everyone be respectful and mindful of the time in your discussions. So we should see on our screens invitations to join breakout groups. When that pops up on your screen, go ahead and accept that, and then go to the group. If you don't click it, if you click later, I think is the option to join later, you'll be in this main room, but there won't be anything going on here, right? All the activities going on in the breakout groups. So if you need to find that later, the option is still there for you at the bottom of your screen. So go ahead and join these breakout groups.
It's just us again. Y'all did a great job. Thank you for sharing and you participating in conversation. I know it's kind of hard to do over Zoom. If we were in person, this would be so much easier. We would be able to talk a little bit more quickly and freely. So thank you for enduring this on Zoom. Welcome back, everybody. Glad you're joining us again. I hope you had some good conversations in your breakout groups. Welcome back. Okay, Elise, I'll turn it back over to you.
That little one.
All right, remember to unmute yourself as you're coming back into the larger group. I'm looking for where to mute people. Okay. We are going to have some final reflections, but before we dive into that, I think it might be helpful to give everybody just a couple of minutes in silence. You know, we at DaySpring aren't too uncomfortable with silence, so I'll give you at least a minute, maybe two, in silence to begin to think about your own, where you might see yourself adopting one of these roles in your families or in your communities as refuge, as mediator, or as prophetic voice. So I'll give you a minute of silence to think about where you seem most drawn to. And it might be helpful to think about a particular issue to see where you might be most drawn regarding that. All right, I'll bring you back to the larger group from your individual reflections. Let's start off considering whether in your groups you found particular areas of agreement, whether you found shared values or common ground that resulted from the dialogue, or whether you saw any areas of agreement, shared values, or common ground among the different options. So were there particular areas of agreement, shared values, or common ground that resulted from the dialogue? I'll put the question in the chat, and if you want to speak up, go ahead and raise your hand. You can like do it like this, or you can use the reactions or the participants button to raise your hand if you want to speak up. You can also drop your thoughts into the chat if you don't want to speak up out loud.
Elise, I was just going to say, in our group, we all agreed that we had seen the prophetic voice used, or the prophetic stance used inappropriately in some ways, and so that led to some hesitancy. We've seen the church as mediator role used in some ways that allowed people to hide behind taking some important steps. We remembered kind of what we read about MLK and the bus boycotts. So.
Great, thank you. Mm-hmm. Anyone else? Were there particular areas of agreement, shared values, or common ground that you discovered in your dialogue?
There's a lot of interest in our group around the church's mediator. I think that one comment even made that perhaps this is the church's refuge, to have a community of people who are actually comfortable having conversations, important conversations about divisive issues, and yet who can have the conversations in a reasonable and centered on Christ kind of way. I think there was a desire to not shy away from the conversations that need to be that perhaps need to be happening, but to actually engage them.
me ask, how are you thinking differently, or are you thinking any differently about the church's role in a divided society, based on your participation this afternoon? So, did anything open up for you, or is your thinking much the same as it was before? And again, you can raise your hand, flag me down and unmute yourself, or you can drop those ideas in the chat.
Elise, I'll just share that in our group, we talked about the different ways that DaySpring has embodied actually each of these three. And that was helpful for me to be reminded of. A lot of them were stories that I had heard or have experienced personally, but it was great that we have seen some change in our church in each of these three options over the years and as our size has grown, but also in the different ways that we understand our role, and that often the stance that we might inhibit collectively is very different than the stances that then each of us embodies personally or as families. And I felt really encouraged by that.
Great. Well, we did want everyone to get some encouragement. So I'm glad that you felt that encouragement in your group. Just reflecting on DaySpring's past, which again is really appropriate for Covenant Day, right? To look forward with also a sense of where we've been. So anyone in that group, if you can list some of those in the chat, that would be helpful for all of us. I'm going to open up a poll, so to ask some more specific questions and give you a scale. So these aren't open-ended questions. Just choose options. Again, we're not making any big policy positions or anything. This isn't going to give us our next action steps or anything like that. But it does give us a sense of where we are, at least today. And it would be helpful to see whether there's a lot of diversity of positions on this within the church, or whether there's some agreement around one or two things maybe. It's just helpful to know where we are. And so if you can take a moment to fill out that poll, that would be helpful. So we have one last reflection question, one last open-ended one. And this one is like the million-dollar question here, right? Considering our own congregation and our Waco community, what steps might you suggest for our role in this contentious time in American life? So what actions might you suggest? Not simply one stance or one option, but what are some of the actions discussed in those options that make sense for us? And again, you're not making this isn't going to happen necessarily because you say it, but what are you thinking? What are some of the steps you might suggest we take? The church as mediator option suggested that churches train people in dialogue and deliberation. In our group, there seemed to be some agreement around that in a way, and that maybe it's easier to learn how to do that in a setting where you mostly like everybody and have a sense of love and ties that bind. What are some of your thoughts about that, as having more ways of being trained in dialogue and deliberation?
Just that the more we practice, the better we'll get at doing it. and that it's really appealing to have that practice be in a safe, some in our group talked about, I think it may have been Bruce talked about, it seemed like a refuge to have a space where that can be safely learned.
Yeah, that came up in our group too. The idea that refuge might be the safety to do some of this more difficult work, right? That we practice in our safe community. Anyone else want to share next steps, perhaps, or what you might think? Perhaps you didn't like any of the three options. What might be a role you would think that the church could occupy in this contentious time? Jonathan, go ahead.
Something that Dr. Reed said in our breakout session was we often, when we go into things, plan with the end in mind and that we will already have it resolved. And that is not realistic, nor is it healthy to already come in with like, this is how we'll end it. And it's for us, like as we talk about with everything in life, we hold it loosely before the Lord and the Holy Spirit who is present among us. And so things may not resolve the way we think, but we can't plan it to resolve the way we want it to, if that makes sense.
Wonderful.
Elise, I just wanted to jump in and add, if you're feeling stressed by trying to do the poll and talk, it's okay to let the poll go. You don't have to do the poll, it's fine. But I did want to read a couple of the comments that were here in the chat. Jen Kemper said that in the early years, the 7 families that founded the church were in many ways prophetic in their personal and vocational lives, while coming to a shared experience in worship as a place of refuge from very diverse political and even theological issues. But they continue to have hard conversations with each other around dining tables and each other's homes, just not on church grounds. And it allowed the church to grow together and be formed by each other and become church. A couple other comments: church is discerning together to the voice of the Spirit by Mike and Emily Smith. Oh, Brett Gibson, being a community that embodies constructive, reasonable dialogue around contentious issues.
I think many of the things that have come up in the groups and then also in some of the comments here are about, you know, centering our commitment to Christ and understanding ourselves as followers of Christ. And so I thank you for giving your time to this today. We know that our lives as the church and following Christ isn't only something we do in our congregation, but something we do in engagement with our surrounding society and our families. And I know many of you are concerned about, like, how are you going to handle holidays and the election season, you know, as someone who's committed to, you know, following Christ faithfully, but knowing that there's so much turmoil going on. So I just want to encourage you to continue thinking about ways that you might engage in dialogue and deliberation in non-confrontational ways, but, you know, leave room for those other options as well, that there might be a time for a prophetic voice, that there might be a time for you to be simply refuge, or for you to seek refuge. So, you know, thank you for being here and showing up and bringing your hearts and your experiences into the discussion. We know it's hard to do this over Zoom sometimes. It's not quite the same as all of us being together. But I do hope that your voices were heard and that you listened to others. And I'm just so grateful we got to be church together working through this. So that's it.
I have a couple of things to add. Would you mind just mentioning a little bit about Advent? And you know, we've been talking since this summer about how we really want to have a church-wide conversation on what is DaySpring's contribution to some of the racial tensions and crisis that we have experienced this year as a country. And so we hope to come up with some pretty particular and practical ways that DaySpring can have a contribution. We want to talk about that at Advent. So Lisa, is there anything you want to say about that?
Yeah, so, you know, some of you mentioned it's hard to talk in generalities around the church's position in a conflicted society. Around Advent, we'll be talking specifically about racism. So over the summer, we laid some of the history and theological background around where we are in this moment dealing with issues regarding race. During Advent, we'll really take on what might be some actions. And this language we discussed today about these roles and actions related to those, that will come up again. So, so this is in some ways preparatory work for that, but hopefully helpful to you in other ways as well. So we will be doing a study that focuses on the themes of Advent, but it seems appropriate when we're in Advent expressing this longing and this hope for a world that we're not in yet, or for the salvation and redemption that Christ brings, for us to really reflect on the ways in which that even the work of salvation is not yet complete and how we can participate in that. So, so that's what we'll be doing specifically around the issue of racism, and we'll be getting into some practical stuff there. So if you're still waiting on that action step, that'll come towards Advent.
So if you took notes for your group, if you would send those to me at tiffany@ourDayspring.org, then I'll compile all those together, and we'll have a way in which you can look at those and read over those. And then we will also have them for us to review as we move into a more practical conversation at Advent about what kind of voices DaySpring want to have in our Waco community.
And the ground rules were sent out in an email. I'm seeing if I can pull that up and drop it in the chat here as well. Yeah, okay, so I'll drop that in the chat too for everyone.
Yeah, okay, any other questions? Okay.
Hey, Tiffany.
Yes.
There were two, Monty brought up in the chat, I don't know if you saw that, about learning how to have these conversations in a non-confrontational way.
Okay, I didn't see that yet, no.
On listening and speaking.
Okay.
And then Jen said.
That's good, thank you. Yeah, we can think about that. Would love any thoughts that you all have about that, how we could do it, when we could do it, who could do it. So yeah, feel free to send me an email. I'd love to hear more about that.
All right, everyone, thank you. Have a nice evening.
Good night.
And everybody.
Goodbye, everybody.